That I am, myself, just personally, come from a family that has members of law enforcement, and it also has members who have done time. And so I see this as a very complicated issue. And so the way I approach this, both because of my training, but also just kind of intuitively what I'm drawn to, is to approach this question and these thorny issues of how we might solve the crisis we're in as a historian, to kind of give it the long perspective. And I'd like to show you my slides, but are we warming up here, or do we know? We are warming up. Okay, good. Well, then I'll just proceed without warming up. So the reason we're here, as we've heard, is because we are in a crisis, a really immediate crisis. We could define the crisis in a lot of ways. We could define it as a crisis of immigration, meaning immigration, how people who are trying to immigrate and who have immigrated here are treated. We could talk about it as a crisis that people who are of Muslim faith are targeted for their beliefs. We could talk about it as a criminal justice crisis, as a mass incarceration crisis, as a policing crisis. What I want to focus on today, primarily because it's what I'm working on, but also because it's just so much in the news, is this crisis of how many deaths there have been recently at the hands of law enforcement. And I want to talk about this because I think that really this is an epicenter of a crisis, not because it's necessarily new, but because it's something that is very immediate, something we can get our hands around, and something that we need to talk about both as citizens, as members of law enforcement, and also as members of communities that have been targeted and have experienced this. So what are we talking about when we're talking about this crisis? Well, one of the important things that the chief refers to is that we don't really know the data. We need much more information on the extent of this crisis. We don't have a really full accounting of how many things go awry in a stop and frisk, or how many things go awry in a basic encounter between police officers and citizens. But we do know a little bit. We know today that young black men are 21 more times likely than their white peers to be killed by the police. And it seems that black children have fared just as badly. Since 1980, a full 67% of the 151 teenagers were African American, and 66% of the 44 children under 14 who were killed by members of law enforcement were African American. And indeed, we know that between 2010 and 2012 alone, 15 teenagers were shot running away from officers, and all but one of these were also African American. This is the kind of crisis we're talking about. We're also talking about a crisis that's not just numbers. We're talking about a crisis, of course, that is real people. We're talking about an extraordinary number of deaths of people who were somebody's brother, somebody's son, somebody's daughter. We're talking about the death of young black boys and men: Kamani Gray, Amadou Diallo, Sean Bell, Oscar Grant, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Antonio Martin, Tamir Rice, and I can go on. And of course, most recently, as in 2 days ago, Tony Robinson in Madison, Wisconsin. And we're here as well because we're talking about real live, used to be live, little girls, of African-American little girls and women. Rakia Boyd, Yvette Smith, Ora Roser, 7-year-old Ayanna Stanley Jones, who was killed in Detroit, where I'm from, during a raid. And here too, again, I could go on. We often don't mention the girls, we often don't mention the women, but this is an equal part of this crisis. So this is the crises that have touched off so many months of protest in Ferguson, in New York, in Ann Arbor, and if you're watching the news, of course, right now in Madison, Wisconsin. So we're here to talk about immediate crisis, but again, because I'm a historian, I want to talk to you about the long-term crisis. And my God, I wish I could show you my slides. Which is, I was telling you about the crisis, that's some of the data that we do have, and again, we don't know. We have no mandatory reporting on officer-initiated shootings that have resulted in death. We don't know a lot about this. Some of the data we talked about, and the real people that we talked about. Both boys and girls. But what I want to talk to you about is the long history of this crisis, because again, as I said, I'm a historian. So what I want to say is that this is not actually an immediate crisis, this is a long-term crisis, and it's really important to locate that long-term crisis. And I want to say that the crisis is located in the fact that police throughout American history have been called upon to do three central things: to police existing racial borders, to police racial unrest and to uphold laws that are often racialized. Now, it's important to talk about this because it gets at the very heart of why this crisis is in fact systemic, why it is actually not helpful, as Chief Burbank mentioned, to focus on the actions just of one police officer, why the one bad apple thesis is not particularly helpful, and why we may not, in fact, get out of this mess with body cameras, although I certainly welcome them, and why the real change that we're seeking must come from recognizing that it's about policy, not just practice. And until we recognize that, and really what we're talking about is until we recognize that lives matter, and not just any lives, but that Black lives matter, Muslim lives matter, right? Non-white, non-Christian lives matter. Until we sort of get at this deeper, longer systemic history, I think we're going to be in trouble. So first I want to talk about this first point, which is about policing racial boundaries and borders. And this is why history is important. Because let's go back just to the Civil War. We could go back farther, but let's just go back to the Civil War. From the end of the Civil War forward, the police were expected to police existing racial borders and boundaries, both by turning a blind eye to extra-legal lynching and actively enforcing Black codes in the South, for example, to maintain existing racial order. But actually, they didn't call it existing racial order. They just said order, to maintain order. And if we went forward to World War II, and this is really a crash course in American history, whether we were talking about St. Louis in 1917 or Chicago in 1919 or Greenwood, Oklahoma outside of Tulsa in 1921, again, the police were called upon, particularly by white citizens, particularly in the era of Jim Crow, to police boundaries, to make sure that Black folks stayed where they were supposed to stay, to make sure that white folks felt safe, which meant keeping Black folks in various designated areas. And if we jump forward to World War II and beyond, police departments again were called upon, again made proxy for the larger white community to kind of police boundaries. And this was particularly important because after World War II, white vigilante justice, kind of Ku Klux Klan justice, was really frowned upon. Indeed, it was not so easy to go out in the middle of, say, Detroit, Michigan, downtown on Woodward Avenue, donned in sheets. But what you could do was you could call upon the police to police these existing racial boundaries. And indeed, what did that mean in Detroit in the 1940s and 1950s? That meant keeping segregated boundaries. It meant, for example, making sure that white folks were not forced to have Black folks move into their neighborhoods, places like Chicago. So housing desegregation was a big site of this, and so forth. And of course this mattered, because the expectation that police officers would police racial boundaries ensured that they were always placed and always expected to act in opposition to one community's interests and for another community's interest. And of course, there was something deeply violent about that, or deeply ironic about that, because in the midst of this, we also began to get very determined and very distinct ideas about what violence was. Who was violent, who wasn't violent, who needed policing, who didn't. Indeed, protecting whites meant often turning a blind eye to egregious acts of white violence, right? Whether it was lynching or whether it was, for example, the violence that kept Blacks out of all white communities in Cicero, Illinois, or Grosse Pointe, Michigan. But it also meant ignoring the fact that often Blacks were the victims of violence, not necessarily the perpetrators of violence. So this is all a very, very deep history, whether it was the way that lunch counters were policed at Woolworths in the South in the 1960s, whether it was the way that neighborhoods were policed in places like Chicago and Detroit in the 1940s and 50s, and then I could go on. Now this leads us to the 1960s because we really enter another era. It's actually not another era because these things all went on simultaneously, but I'm going to focus on the 60s now as an era of policing racial boundaries. I hope that you're kind of seeing two sides at once, but you realize we're going from left to right. So, oh no, actually you're not. Are you seeing the same slide? What's happening here? Oh, you are seeing the same thing. Okay, good. Okay, so we go into the 1960s, and of course, the more that African Americans endured white violence against them, whether it was seeing a child lynched, experiencing one's entire community being burned to the ground, such as in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, or watching family members being bitten by police dogs or blasted by fire hoses in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, eventually African Americans protested these indignities and these injustices. And here too the police had a role. Now too, once again, they were expected to maintain order for the public. And who was the public? What did keeping peace mean? Keeping peace, once again, meant policing boundaries. In this case, the boundaries that were transgressed during moments of racial unrest. What did this look like? Well, if you look in 1964, whether it was Philadelphia or Harlem or Rochester, we could just go on, as African Americans protested injustices in their community. Often this ended up into a conflict with police. Why? Because guess what was one of the main things that they were protesting in the 1960s? Police brutality. In a city like Detroit in this time period, there's a very interesting report I talk about in my book where they did a community study of police violence in the black community. And in one particular neighborhood, they saw that there was 1,000 injuries. 1,000 injuries that took place between police and the community. And 250 of them were to police officers. And the rest were to community members, black community members. And of the injuries to the police officers, they were to the hands and the knuckles. And of the injuries to the citizenry, to the head. So when we're talking about policing boundaries and we're talking about policing racial unrest, we are talking about a policing that was inherently asking officers to do something that was deeply racialized from the very beginning. And this was a very important moment because when we saw this much racial unrest and we saw policing racializing unrest, many politicians decided that racial unrest was the same thing as crime and disorder. White politicians had been fine seeing civil rights protests in the South. And indeed, when police officers like Sheriff Bull Connor would send in the police dogs and start beating down people and throwing police dogs at them, white police officers and certainly mayors and certainly politicians could say, look, what's wrong with those crackers? They're a bunch of racists. Let's send down some federal troops. Let's get things straightened out in Selma or in Birmingham or wherever. But when the same things were going down in northern cities like Detroit or Philadelphia or Rochester or New Haven, Connecticut, I mean, we could just go on and on and on, the response was not that way. Indeed, the response was, this is crime, this is unrest, this is disorder. And we began a war on crime. We began a war on crime in 1965, right after Harlem, Rochester, Philadelphia, and I could go on. We began a war on crime actually before the crime rate was at all remarkable. The murder rate in 1965 had not been that low since 1910. The violent crime rate was far worse in 1995 than it was in 1965. I mean staggeringly worse after we had engaged in the war on crime for several decades. But we began a war on crime because, again, we were doing something a little different than just policing crime. Similarly, of course, and this is a segue off my paper, and just indulge me a few seconds, right after the Civil War, you might be interested to know that we also had a civil rights era, 4 million newly freed people looking for jobs, looking for a voice in the polity, and white Southerners responded to it by criminalizing black space, passing all kinds of laws that hadn't been laws before, making the sentences for those laws that did exist far worse. And places like the Georgia State Penitentiary went from being all white in 1863 to all black by 1893. Not because white folks stopped committing crime and black folks lost their mind, but because the actual policies, the actual tasks that were given police officers on the ground changed and were made much more explicitly about policing boundaries, and specifically racial boundaries. So in 1964, 1965, we start a war on crime. And make no mistake about it, it wasn't just Nixon that started it. It was actually Johnson. Johnson is the one that started the Law Enforcement Administration Act, which gave the actual monies to police departments to start arming themselves with flak jackets and all kinds of equipment that they didn't have before. But guess how you got that equipment in Detroit in 1967? You had to show that crime was going up. And before crime was actually going up in Detroit, they started to actually change the way we counted crime to make crime go up. The mayor himself and the police commissioner himself finally had to go public and say, well, it's not actually that crime is going up so much, it's just that we start counting things differently, robberies, larcenies, we just change it up a little bit. Now eventually we're going to get crime, and we're going to get a pretty serious crime and violence problem. But that's in no small part because of the war on crime. Because what happens is the war on crime, which is added to by the war on drugs, right? Which is added to by all kinds of low-level policing, the criminalizing of space in new ways, broken windows policing, stop and frisk. By the way, and a change of laws that gave whole new powers to the police. We talk about stop and frisk. One of the reasons why stop and frisk is possible is because we have Supreme Court challenges to all this that are ruled in 1967, for example, or 68, I guess it is, with Terry stops. It's okay. You can pull somebody over because you want to. We get Miranda, that's the good news. We get Terry stops, that's the bad news. The bad news is that that's the bad news legally that will lead to stop and frisk one day. So eventually all of this is going to lead us to mass incarceration. And mass incarceration, as we've already heard tonight, is deeply racialized. Why? Because of the long history of everything else that I was just telling you. Because where policing is, and of course what the chief says, where policing is concentrated, where we've decided crime resides, how we defined crime, who we think the criminals are. And indeed, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, whether it's young black women who now are ages 18 to 19 are 5 times more likely to be in prison than white young women of the same age, or whether it's young African American men, way disproportionately in the system than white men. But again, this is the consequence, not the cause. And if we go forward, why is that? Because again, the police are asked to uphold the law, right? And thank God, because there's, as we've already heard, we don't want child abusers running around, and we don't want rapists running around, and we don't want pedophiles on the loose, and we could just go on and on. So this is not a condemnation of policing. This is a condemnation of our long history of racialized policing and the job that we are asking the police repeatedly, and when who do I mean we? The nation, the policies are asking the police to uphold. Because when you ask to uphold laws, and the laws are racialized, you've got a problem. And what do I mean by racialized laws? Well, I could give you a million examples, but let's start with the easiest one, and you all know this already, but I always love to start with the easiest one. We already heard tonight about the blue meth story. Well, this is sort of like the crack cocaine and the powder cocaine disparity. Obama has fixed this. It used to be a disparity of 100-1. Now it's a disparity of 10-1. It shouldn't be a disparity at all. It's chemically exactly the same drug. But this is an example of racialized policing. What? But is it racialized policing? Yes. But what was it first? It was racialized policy. It was racialized policy. And so, yet again, the police are called to uphold laws that are themselves racialized. So drugs. We were just looking at cocaine, but now let's just look at any drugs. What do you notice about these graphs that are just so startling? Who's using versus who's getting arrested? Who's selling versus who's getting arrested? And then again, we begin to see some disproportionality in how laws are made and therefore later policed. And what about stop and frisk? Again, the law is what leads to the policing. You can do stop and frisk only because the legislature and the Supreme Court says that it's okay to do it. My students often say to me, well, surely that's illegal. Is that illegal? And the historian's answer to that question is everything is legal until it isn't. That is to say, no, it's not illegal unless somebody has challenged it. So if you look at stop and frisk, again, deeply disproportionate because of the inherent biases that we've already heard about, but also because of this deeply long history of racialized law and legislation. And finally, I even want to look at oops, I'm backing up. That was actually, I've lost this one. Okay, this was the broken windows policing. Broken windows policing accounts for so much of that police presence in communities, right? Your music is too loud. Your lawn is too much of a mess. You're selling marijuana out of your front lawn, whatever it is. This too ends up being deeply disproportionate. And this too is what leads to so much conflict. Both for the police, imagine being a police officer who's constantly being sent out into a community to do this kind of low-level policing, but also imagine being the person that's constantly being thrown up against a wall, constantly being broken windows policed. It is really important to realize that Eric Garner, right, that whole story in New York, the guy who ends up in chokehold and he dies, if you listen to that video, what does he say? He says, why are you guys harassing me? Why are you guys harassing me? What was he really doing? He was selling loosies. He was selling illegal cigarettes. This is these kind of nuisance crimes that are being policed at he's not Noriega. He's not a major drug dealer. He's selling loosies. But that kind of level of interaction between the police and particularly the poor community, particularly black community, brown community, is the result of this kind of changes to the law and this kinds of policing. Anyway, I need to wrap up. So what does this all mean? Why am I going through this history in a very, very quick say? Well, I'm happy to flesh any of this out if you want me to. But the upshot of all of this is that a far greater police presence in certain neighborhoods, when the police are being asked to do a higher level of just kind of that petty policing, in a larger context of racialized laws and racialized policing, means that we are dealing with a deeply systemic problem. Again, we are dealing with a problem that the solution would be nice to say, well, let's put in body cameras. But the Eric Garner story tells us the limitations of even body cameras, right? We saw something that was different than the grand jury saw in this case. Why didn't the grand jury see what we saw? Well, here's the thing. The grand jury might have seen what we saw, believe it or not. But what you might not know is behind the scenes, again, I'm going to go to law and policy, it is almost impossible to get in an indictment in so many of these cases. That doesn't mean that all prosecutors try to do so evenly or even eagerly, but I'm literally just talking about the policies. So it's actually not as easy to match up what you see and what the law is going to do in the way that you might hope that it would. So I guess I'll just leave you with the thought, again, that it's the long history here that we really need to think about. If we are really interested in making communities safer, hyper-policing is not the way to do it. We now know that as a result of mass incarceration and the hyper incarceration of particular neighborhoods, they are less safe than they have ever been. We know that the drug war has made people less safe, just like Prohibition did. Anybody ever watch Boardwalk Empire? Right? Everyone see the shoot 'em up. Why are they shooting? What's the problem? It's, again, because there's now been a new illegal trade introduced. The drug war was devastating. Mass incarceration was devastating. But what was really devastating in the long run was this long history in which police have constantly been put at the forefront of policing unjust laws, racialized laws, laws that protect white people and don't protect anybody else, laws that make white people feel safer now as they're in Times Square and they're shopping at the Gap and they're putting their kids on the roller coaster at Toys R Us, laws that make white people feel safer but in turn are devastating other communities. And it's because the police are the ones who are charged with that. They are put in front and center in that we need to look at the broader policies, not just at Darren Wilson, not just at the guy, but at these deeper policies. Thank you.